Howdy folks, Cory here, excited to have you for a fall garden tour. Recording this mid-November here in San Antonio, Texas. I'm technically on the Blackland Prairie, that's my eco-region here. So in today's video, I'm gonna walk you through specifically our perimeter planting plan. We've done a lot of planting this fall over the course of the last year or so as well. So I wanna talk about, native and adapted plant screening, how I've thought about organizing and designing that as a monarch flies past me, both on our side front and other side yard, for ways to potentially give you interest, diversity with native plant species, but also some privacy and protection if you feel like you need that. San Antonio has issues with stray dogs, and so we want to try and enclose our property as much as we can, working around some conservation rules of our neighborhood where we may not be able to put a fence or not. So if that applies to you in any sort of way, you feel limited in what you can do with your front yard, typically landscaping is a way to work around those things, and that's what I want to talk with you about today. All right, y'all, so first part of my property, kind of a left side perimeter, which will be something of a native and adapted plant screen for us. Almost a living fence, but I want to make sure and give it a natural look in the way that I assemble and place plants and stagger them and put them together. We also got two wandering toddlers who love to play in this front yard, and so to reduce the options of the places that they can go and kind of contain them is an important objective of my wife and I. So we're working in dappled shade here, heavier shade definitely during the fall and winter because of this beautiful mature live oak tree that we love so much. Here, starting at the fence line, we have American Beautyberry, a deciduous shrub. These did quite well for me this year, but I'm excited to see these shape more fully each year on this edge part of our driveway. We do have a bit too much driveway, but hey, what are you going to do? Maybe we'll rip up asphalt at some point, but that's not now. Jumping in maybe with something a little bit more rare and unique, we have this Berlandier's fiddlewood. It's one that had a little bit of transplant shock when I put it in, but it's since recovered beautifully, so I could perhaps trim those tops off and clean it up a little bit. Elsewhere here, we have a small new Texas torchwood as well from my friend William Glenn. This is a really versatile shrub. Again, this is a semi-evergreen one, but we don't necessarily need that evergreen protection here. With some inspiration from a trip to Palmetto State Park, I put in a couple of dwarf palms here. Slow growing and will require a bit more moisture to get themselves established and most resilient, but I do love the dwarf palms. And then another understory shrub or small trees, the roughleaf dogwood here. This can be an absolute butterfly magnet. I've seen these do quite well in areas with a little bit more moisture. The more sun it gets, the more moisture it might require and benefit from. But I think that this circumstance here can be a bit shaded, and so I think that this one will establish just fine. And then here we have an interesting understory tree that I've had for a little bit now. This is the Carolina buckthorn. And so I really like the glossy leaves here. This is also deciduous, so it will lose these, but it has these really beautiful, interesting looking leaves, and I like its growth pattern. It's definitely a unique one to have. Develop some berries that birds will love as well. Another good one that I'd recommend. Then here on the edge, definitely more of a smaller shrub is this hog plum. And so I've actually never seen one of these in bloom, but apparently the blooms are kind of a greenish white. And so that'll be interesting to have. Again, I love diversity of species, and so I'm kind of a collector with these at heart, thinking about our landscape, something like a botanical garden, without stretching our native regions too much. Not going to put in something in the ground that's going to require too much work. So I'm always excited to get something unique and new, and I believe I got this from my friend Drake White at the Nectar Bar here in San Antonio. I've also put in a couple of new Yaupon hollies here. These are evergreen, very versatile native shrubs. I also picked these up from Drake White. It's hard to find these smaller than 10 gallons or so. I feel like I only see these Yaupons for $160 or something crazy like that. And that's very difficult if you're trying to build, something of a whole, fence line essentially with these. I have a few of those in the ground staggered here behind me, but also intermixed with the cherry laurel, which is another potential native evergreen screening plant. It's a really great one. Beautiful white flowers, white blooms, you know, very versatile. Might like a little bit more moisture to establish, but should be quite resilient over time, you know, if you give it the proper moisture to settle in. And speaking of here, these were ones that I was able to find at a much smaller size. My friend Willie at Greensleeves has a lot of trees and shrubs in 1 gallon and 4-inch planters, which I just find absolutely incredible. I love seeing that at a nursery, especially when you're like me and you want to put a lot of plants in the ground. You know, I always like to plant with density and diversity. So it's nice to see, you know, a nursery that's keeping those in stock at such small and accessible sizes and then prices. This here is a Mexican plum that I actually propagated from cuttings myself. It's nice to see this continue to do well. It'll be interesting to see how this shapes and grows over time. This here is a rare native species, the soapbush or guayacán. So slow growing. I don't know if this has grown an inch since I've had it, but not that I've really paid attention to it much either, but it's an interesting one, you know, to have here. It is semi-evergreen, but you know, we do have this screen here already, so it's not necessarily something that, you know, I'm worried about growing really fast. You know, we'll start to see how everything kind of grows in layers and different densities. You know, for me, it's about staggering both. You know, I want that evergreen structure in the back, the thing that will ultimately create the screen. I likewise too, you know, want to think in layers, right? So that means, you know, getting things of different shapes and sizes, you know, and growth habits that can complement each other really well. You know, for me, the ultimate goal, and there's a lot of wide open space here because what we were dealing with was really just open lawn, you know, across the entirety of our front yard. You know, I really like what my friend Willie had to say about slow gardening. You know, it's really important and I think valuable, although it requires patience to watch and see how things grow in, right? You get new ideas constantly, especially if you're, you know, exposing yourself to new plants constantly, new spaces, new natural areas, you know, or the same ones, and just taking the time to really study them and watch them to see how things grow in, change over the course of the year, what flowers when, you know, what isn't, and how, you know, all those things can potentially grow together in a very unique and interesting way. Even if it's something, you know, growing and overlapping another thing, you know, I think that there can be some interesting looks and things to take from that. But you know, back to things that I've absolutely loved here and have thrived. This is our Prairie Flameleaf Sumac. This is a really fast-growing tree. I believe this tree is nearing 3 years old here on our property, but I believe we put it in the ground at maybe 5 gallons, and it's grown really rather fast. So this is in fact deciduous. The Prairie Flameleaf Sumac is a tree that I've fallen in love with. I love the change of colors of its leaves, and we'll see that later this year a little bit. But also, you know, you can get these sumac berries, which I've heard, I haven't done, can be made potentially into a sumac aid, like a Prairie Flameleaf Sumac lemonade. So I'll be interested to try that in the future too. Moving on here, you know, as we get into more full sun all year round, you know, we're stretching a little bit with the cherry laurel. It can certainly handle its, you know, its proper level of sun. You have that little 4-incher there. But, you know, as we get into much drier, sustained full sun outside of the live oak canopy, we have this evergreen sumac here, and I have a few of these. Texas ebony here, another unique but deciduous, a small native tree here. This has been one that's been rather slow growing. I honestly think someone mowed it and kind of cut it back, but it's bouncing back. So happy to have it. And, you know, really kind of fully immersing ourselves in the hotter, drier section of this, we do have a century agave, a plant there that we put in this fall also, as it's a little pup. Definitely a good sign. You know, this one's healthy and I think this one's happy. We have the Texas sage, which I did a transplant this last late winter. Those have, you know, done just fine, hung on. Got the Vassey's wild lime, a unique, interesting, more kind of Rio Grande Valley native shrub, deciduous. What I read is there, you know, may be concerns with cold hardiness, but, you know, I got advice from Willie Glenn at Greensleeves that it should do just fine. And, you know, I'm thinking about keeping it decently mulched this winter. Not that that might be something that it would experience in its natural environment, but, you know, I think that maybe the Texas sage behind it, this, you know, desert willow, some of these things can give it a little bit of a break from, you know, maybe harsh cold winter winds. But moving on, Have a front desert mallow here that I think will, you know, have beautiful little kind of cup blooms, kind of an orangish sort of clementine color, I believe, in those blooms. I'm excited to see. These are Gulf Muhly, you know, the pink cloud native grasses, and you can see we're getting a little bit of that to start, just a little bit, which is fun to see. This desert willow here, complete transplant. You know, it's definitely one of good size that I was a bit worried about, but it's done just fine. It even bloomed, you know, a good amount this year. Red yucca here remaining in bloom. And it's nice to know what to maybe double down on, you know, if you're wanting certain seasonal color and stuff like that, or, you know, wanting to keep activity for pollinators. I love the red yucca, super common landscape plant here in the San Antonio area, but I think for good reason. So this is kind of an interesting conundrum and something, you know, that I want to throw out to y'all. Definitely kind of messy, unagreeable species here that constantly return. Two things, the spiny hackberry, you can see right here. And for those of you who are identification junkies, you might notice that there's differences here. So I think that what this is, and I'd be curious to throw this out to all y'all, I think this is a Bluewood Candelia, or Brazil, another common name for it. But, you know, the question that I'm throwing out to everyone else here mostly is how to keep species like that looking a little bit more agreeable, you know? So this is a very kind of public front-facing spot for us, and it, you know, this section sort of conjoins with our neighbor's driveway, and we want to be respectful, but I also love to keep, you know, native species growing in there, especially if it's going to be such a pain to try and keep battling them back. You know, that hackberry, to some extent, it wants to be there. That Bluewood Candelia, to some extent, it really wants to be there, you know, and so me trying to kind of, you know, pave over it, so to speak, with sheet mulch or whatever, it's not really going to work. So any tips welcome on how to keep those things kind of clean and polished, you know, please send them my way. Continuing on, you know, with finish, I've talked about my flame acanthus here before. This is something that's continued to bloom just all year round. If you have a blank canvas of a yard and you want to get coverage fast and life and activity, plant flame acanthus early. If you want something that's agreeable, don't, because this is helping to plant part of our neighbor's garden over there. They're welcoming the transplants, but you know, that flame acanthus will shoot sprouts all over the yard. The Skeletonleaf Goldeneye, great blooms this year. I featured this in an earlier tour, and we can maybe cross it with that you can see. It was like late spring, no longer blooming, but still might get some blooms here as second little fall cycle. New plantings this fall, just put these in the ground. Blackfoot daisy here, a really brutally hot, surrounded by asphalt corner of this property here. Blackfoot daisy, I think, will be a virtuous addition to this spot. So that's that native plant screen, you know, and it goes really from super dry, super hot, you know, radiating heat between the driveways as the section narrows, to almost more of kind of a, you know, a woodland edge, a canopy, you know, understory underneath that live oak. So I'm excited to see that fill in. You know, at least it's good for me to see that I have everything planted that has that absolute furthest evergreen structure established. You know, there's a little bit of consistency that maybe some kind of hedge patterns will happen, but, you know, I didn't just want to go one long hedge. I don't mind that if that's what someone does. If they do a dozen cherry laurels or what have you, I think that's great. You know, a dozen Yaupon hollies. But what I was interested in trying to replicate was something of, you know, maybe more of a natural look, a diversity of species. Not that you might see those all side to side, but it's nice to see, you know, different ones staggered together that can have different bloom cycles, different, you know, leaf colors and everything, and add some interest and intrigue, and, you know, not exactly feel like a straight row hedge. But moving on here to the front project that's done so well this year, or that we did so well with, was this dry creek bed. So this has performed exceptionally well. You can check out that project. I've featured a whole video on it. This one, you know, we got another little evergreen sumac. It's always nice to kind of, you know, echo plantings from other parts of the property, you know, and so I try to think about stringing things along. Not my idea, someone else's, but that was kind of the idea, is, you know, like find species to kind of continue to repeat throughout your landscape. This here is an Eve's necklace, which I do have planted elsewhere, but this is the, you know, a cousin of the Texas mountain laurel. The front line, which is super hot and dry, you know, Texas sage, which I've talked about on my channel before, a really great evergreen periodic bloomer. Super fun. I grabbed some prickly pear off of a woman's property. She was just shaving off her overgrown prickly pear. I grabbed maybe a dozen here to kind of plant in and weave throughout this front screen. You know, prickly pear is evergreen, right? It's just so, you know, there's nothing more Texas-y than cactus sometimes, I think. I threw in, you know, an agarita here, which can grow quite large and, you know, handle full sun in certain scenarios. I've seen it, you know, kind of in that prairie-like environment. Grow pretty big, handle the sun, no problem. And as well, you know, create some, you know, tasty berries for wildlife and humans alike. Gotta call it out, you know, non-native, something that, you know, a lot of native purists do not like, the oleanders. They've been tough, hardy, and they bloom a huge amount of the year, and I do see them quite active with pollinators. And so is there a better choice? Yes. But do we have anything, you know, that is as evergreen as this is right now, holding this kind of structure for us at the front side of our property, not asking for an extra drip of water? No. So, you know, for now, I'm gonna leave it and I'm gonna mind it. We got 2 of these, you know, that are holding some good space and giving us a little bit more privacy than we otherwise would have. I really love the different colors of this switchgrass here. Something that we just put in this year. This is kind of a tall, tall kind of statement, you know, erect grass that will stand and be something, can be kind of a structure of that. I see, you know, as ants rule the world, there's tons of ants all over this, making their home there, as they do everywhere on our property out here in the really hottest dry spots. But a couple of these switchgrasses in here I'm really excited to have. I think they're a fun one. And so I love to put, you know, logs and stuff like this in, you know, to be both habitat, but kind of a little bit of accents, you know, and they'll help kind of keep things established and in place over time. But then you get these little fun, you know, ways to plant something like this, a goldenrod, just kind of tucked in that little crevasse there. And it's kind of a little nook, you know, there in that stump. So I love to play with that. Yeah, I think you can get interesting little microclimates out of that, you know, that you otherwise wouldn't. So, you know, consider using that, you know, rocks and big logs and stumps and things like that. Another fast-growing tree that we have here, actually native, the mulberry tree, red mulberry. So this is, you know, native Texas mulberry tree here that has grown really, really fast. I have pruned it up a couple times already, but this is gonna be one that we're gonna let grow. You know, I love its look thus far. It's starting to shed some of its lower leaves, but it's, you know, these big, big leaves. I see the mulberries there, mockingbirds at them. I've got a mountain laurel there. Got that actually from a friend. Someone that had grown that from a cutting. It's, you know, a slower growing tree. We've had it for a couple of years now, but it looks healthy. You know, another right perimeter screen, a mixture of, you know, deciduous and evergreen plants here. Native and some, you know, non-native, adapted and well-behaved ones. Right there we have a little rock rose transplant, which is hanging on here just fine. It might need a watering. Put in a new Texas sage for a little evergreen structure, you know, to kind of repeat from the ones that I have just over there to the left. Have a ratama, gifted from a friend. It's absolutely shot up this year. Fun, fast growing one, you know, a shorter lived tree. Got a pomegranate tree here again, not native, but, you know, a very agreeable, well adapted fruit tree here to Texas. This is actually the only native Texas palm tree. I had to get one palm tree in here. You know, it's going to require some deep waterings now and again to make sure it establishes. It will be slow growing, and so we'll see it as a palm tree in maybe 10 to 30 years. But I had to get one. I just had to get one. That thing looking sad there is actually a datura, or a Jimson weed. It's just because I put it in the ground recently. It's telling me obviously it needs a watering to establish, but I put a lot of plants in the ground, and, you know, it's these reminders like doing a tour for YouTube that you remember you need to go back and water some things. Tons of transplants out here this year. Prairie Barbados, not a native, but a well-adapted and really resilient and prolific species here in San Antonio. Blooms rather profusely, gives some great color, does really well in the heat. You know, the principal lesson being here, you know, take action, get things in the ground. It's so hard to, you know, learn until you see how things grow together or don't, you know, experience a lot of failures. I definitely get myself into a case of, you know, paralysis by overanalyzing to find, you know, the perfect spot, the perfect layers, the perfect plant community, all things working together. But I would just say, start planting and take action. A friend of mine, Mitch Hagney, who I've featured on my channel before, he's the Director of Food Sustainability with the San Antonio Food Bank. He's essentially the head farmer there. Really interesting story. But I had dinner with him the other night, and he use the phrase, become a farmer once you've killed 10,000 plants. And I think the margin for error is different in farming, in food production. It's such a different space than thinking about landscaping, with native and perennial plants. But at the same time, I think in principle the same applies. How do you get much better at choosing which plants and cultivating that sense for what's going to grow well together, what might look interesting and unique, and serve all these various benefits and functions that we talk about here on the channel all the time, right? Pollinators, shade, color, interest, seasonal change in dynamism, different layers, ground covers, things that can grow in different conditions, dry shade or moist sun or whatever. There's so many different variables that you're balancing together. The only thing that you can really do is, apply and, learn from this practical application. And so that's definitely something that I'm trying to adopt more so, tail end of this year. And next is be patient with the fact that it's a long game, to learn and understand the best way to work with our landscapes. And that's why I love having a house that's been such a blank canvas, just a blank space, to really kind of test things out, experiment, and see what works and what doesn't. Because it's hard to know what would be the perfect thing to grow under that fragrant mimosa that I'm looking at here, until you get to see what the fragrant mimosa looks like, as progressively a more full-grown specimen. Whew, as always, so much information, y'all. I hope you enjoy it, and don't feel like it's too rambly. I love sharing these updates. They're a little bit more informal, can share with you a little bit more so as to, what I have going on and what, is coming down the pipeline. So, it's been a pleasure to get connected with many of y'all and learn about, where you're coming from in Texas or beyond Texas. The native plant landscaping and Texas ecology is such a fun journey to be on. So this might be my last garden tour update of this kind this year. So, I'm excited to see what you think. Let me know, as you have collaborations in mind, if there's other channels that you like watching that you'd like me to reach out to and connect with, people who you think that I might get along with. If there's, any other, specific information, tutorials, plants, or things like that you'd like to have me cover over the course, of the end of this year and next year, I really want to be open and responsive to that kind of thing. And so please, let me know with your comments below, or of course, make sure that you're signed up for my email list, my Texas Field Notes, which you can get signed up for. It's completely free at coryames.com. Or if you want to get into something more specific related to Texas native plant landscaping, I have a free email course, 7 Things I Wish I'd Known When Getting Started with Texas Native Plant Landscaping. The idea here is to save you time, money, and dead plants. You can sign up for that at coryames.com/txnative. So much more to come through the end of this year. A lot of videos in the editing bank. These tours are a little bit of a relief for me to not do something so heavily produced and scripted, and so I like them. I hope you like them too. It's kind of a good inside look. So yeah, all right, y'all, until next time.